Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. If you love what you see today, everything is in stock and for sale. We're waking up with watches. You can reach out to me for pricing or details, tmosso at thewatchbox.com. We also love to build inventory, trading, and purchasing. We will buy your entire collection. No upper limit on value paid. We pay cash. We pay fast. We make the process easy to buy, trade, or sell. I am your one-stop shop. Please reach out to me directly, tmosso at thewatchbox.com. All right. To me, there's nothing more impressive in the Rolex collection for sheer presence than a full platinum diamond dial Day-Date 40. So we have a watch 12.1 millimeters thick, 40 in diameter, and because of the pivoted end links on this Day-Date 40 President bracelet, the total distance across the wrist is only 47.6 millimeters. The watch features a 100-meter water-resistant case. If you've ever wondered what the crown looks like on a twin lock in platinum, it's one cycloptic eye or dot, and then we have a dial with ice blue, and the ice blue on Rolex Platinum watches is exclusive to the Platinum watches. Over time, it's become a little bit darker and more saturated. It was once almost silver white. Now you can really see a distinct blue tint to it. Sunburst metallic, blued seconds hand, diamond baguette indices for the hours. In my opinion, one of the finest uses of gems on a men's watch. 70-hour power reserve, automatic winding, shock resistant, highly anti-magnetic, and again, because of the oyster case and crown, 100 meters water resistant. Every Day-Date 40 features a refinement originally introduced on the Platinum Day-Date 2, which is ceramic coated pins inside the bracelet so that over time the pins cannot shrink and wear down and the bracelet cannot stretch. A lovely timepiece. This is really a men's watch. I would recommend ladies consider the 36, but I have seen women pull off the Day-Date 40. It's almost impossible with the broad Day-Date 2 that preceded it, but the Day-Date 40, a lady could actually take a look at this, and because of the short distance across the wrist, you can see how much clearance I've got. You might even be able to pull it off. That said, you're going to be aware of the mass, which is unbelievable. A Rolex 40 millimeter watch in platinum feels like a 43 or a 44 in platinum from any other brand. That's how solid these things are. Now, sticking with our integrated bracelet theme, we have a much more complete integration, Gerald Genta style. This is an extremely rare Nautilus variant, as the 5980 launched in 2006 and was discontinued in 2014, but this 5980 1A019 was only made in 2012 and 2013 before all of these steel 5980s were discontinued for the 5990. So 40.5 millimeters in diameter. It is a flyback chronograph with 120 meters of water resistance. I'm going to wind it up so you can see it in action. Of course, it is a chronograph with flyback capability, and though it has only one chronograph register on the dial, you can see it's a mono counter with coaxial chronograph minutes and hours. And what happens is when you reset it, because it's a flyback, you reset and it automatically restarts, so you can time events that occur in rapid succession. In spite of the use of chronograph pushers, there's no compromise to the 120-meter water resistance of the standard 5711. This is also that. 55-hour automatic winding power reserve. We've got a combination of a column wheel and a vertical clutch. A reasonably wearable watch. It's not like an offshore to the Royal Oak. It's bigger than a 5711 and it's definitely thicker and heavier, but it's like a 5726. So if you've experienced the Nautilus annual calendar, this wears and feels very much like that one. Now, the white dial is an interesting piece because you can see that the hands and the indices are blackened white gold, making for the best contrast and legibility on any Nautilus model. These silver dial Nautilus watches are really fantastic for eyes that normally strain. On the reverse side, you can see the caliber CH 28520, free sprung, silicone anti-magnetic hairspring, column wheel, vertical clutch, ceramic bearings. And you can see quite nicely decorated. You get your money's worth with this movement, both technically and aesthetically. The bracelet, the case, beautifully executed. A big part of what you're paying for when you buy a watch like this is the hand finishing, not just of the movement, but of the individual bracelet links, the case, the bezel, and the complexity of its assembly. The complexity of the Nautilus case, both to finish and fabricate, has long helped to explain why the Nautilus is more expensive than an Aquanaut. It's not just the presence of the bracelet or not, it's the fact that the Nautilus case is a lot more involved to fabricate and finish. All right. So Moser treats us to something different. For 2022, we saw the first Tourbillon entry in the Streamliner sports watch collections. Here we have a fully integrated bracelet, 40 millimeters steel, Streamliner Tourbillon. It's only 12.1 millimeters thick. You can see the case flanks are evacuated. The bracelet is beautifully interlocked, seamless, silky, feels more like fabric than chain links of metal. A wonderful look and a feel. It manages to be redolent of the 70s without directly plagiarizing any one design, and that's a real distinction in this now crowded integrated sports watch class. But integration of bracelet and case takes a second fiddle status to these 60 rainbow-colored sapphires that line the dial. Now, they can be used actually to read 60 minutes, so they are aesthetic, but they're also functional as they act as a minutes track outboard. The dial is an ardoise sunburst metallic, so anthracite or dark silver gray. You can see Moser ghosts on its logo with a clear lacquer. There is globalite luminescent material on the hands. The watch is 120 meters water resistant, so it is a true sports watch, but what really matters is that it's just 12.1 millimeters thick, and as you'll see in a moment when I put it on my wrist, it is a very thin and wearable watch that's short across the wrist. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get those hands out of the way so you can appreciate the Tourbillon, because it does have a couple of standout features. First, the movement itself is a judicious blend, I should say, of hand finish and mechanical finish, but the Tourbillon carriage itself has a much higher proportion of hand finish. It's a flying tourbillon with no upper bridge to block your view. It is a 1-minute tourbillon that can also act as your seconds hand. And if you take a look, you can see that there are two black polished stud holders holding two 180-degree opposed flat hairsprings. So because they're identical springs and they're arrayed exactly opposite each other, in any position, as one is inclined to make the balance beat slower, the other, by an equal and opposite margin, will speed it up. So in any position, it instantaneously equals out the effect of gravity on the tourbillon, and that's something that we haven't seen routinely on tourbillon regulators since they sat stationary upright inside of pockets in pocket watches. So this is a real breakthrough in that regard. The double hairspring system you also see, for example, on the Audemars Piguet escapement, the AP escapement, and on the double spiral tourbillon from Laurent Ferrier. Now on the reverse side, automatic winding, 3-day power reserve. You can see the underside of the tourbillon sits on hybrid ceramic ball bearings, so ceramic balls with steel races. And it's just a really good looking case back. As you can see, a jewel set in a golden chaton fixed by screws, a nod to the pocket watch era of watchmaking at Moser back in the 19th century and early 20th century. We have 4 different finishes on the solid gold rotor, and I promised you a wrist shot. I'm going to show you that now. You can see that the watch really does wear compact, short across the wrist and thin. It'll easily slide underneath a tight cuff, and you can see that the lugs of the case themselves, they come nowhere near the edge of my wrist. So this is a really good option for a man or a woman who wants something extremely special but doesn't want to deal with the bulk that typically comes with a tourbillon sports watches. Okay, I have a bit of a double feature coming up now. Back in 2012, Panerai launched the Radiomir 1940 PAM 399 and the Radiomir 1940 Oro Rosso PAM 398. Take a quick look. Here they are right here. Don't be confused. These are actually one reference. 100 examples of the 399 were made, 100 examples of the 398 were made, and what's important is that of the 100, 50 sets were assembled of 399s and 398s that feature matched serial numbers. So this is part of the PAM 784 pair. Together with matched serials, those 50 sets are considered the PAM 784. Both of these are serial number 20. Now, they're 47mm Radiomir 1940s, and these were the first of the modern Radiomir 1940s, taking after the design of watches like the 6154 Small Egyptian or Small Egiziano. They have strong, highly integrated lug profiles, but they haven't yet incorporated the later crescent-shaped locking crown guard of the 6154. So it's almost like you're halfway between the old 3646 combat watch and the later 6152. 6152 had that crown guard. 54 was the small Egyptian. So just like that, that's the real difference between a Luminor and a Radiomir 1940. So in the tradition of the 6154, we have a big 47mm cushion-like case and a crown without a guard, but you will note that the logo on the crown is the 1970s Panerai interlocking OP logo. So these are not, strictly speaking, 6154 re-editions or pure vintage watches. These are timepieces that have a lovely air of nostalgia, and you can see that in the use of plexiglass over the dial. Both of them do feature plexiglass crystals, just like the original 6154s would have. But the other thing, too, is that they have 30-meter water resistance ratings in spite of screwed-in casebacks and screw-down crowns, because that was the water resistance rating of the original Panerai Combat watch. I do believe these are water resistant to more than 30, but officially it's 30, so I wouldn't recommend you test the limits. Now, big changes do occur on the 398 compared to the 399. First, you can see this has a tobacco brown sandwich dial, whereas this is much more clearly a matte black. Second, you can see that this one features an alligator leather strap, whereas this one features the calfskin Ranger strap. And finally, the 399 has a simple steel pin buckle, whereas the 398 has a double fold deployant with trigger release. But they are mechanically identical, and this is really where the watch becomes very fascinating. A handful of Panerai watches over the last 20 years have included Minerva movements. Minerva, also known as Montblanc Villeret, it is the horlogerie arm of Montblanc. And a few hundred movements are made each year, most of which go into Montblanc watches. And the Montblanc watches are, in contrast to the roughly 100,000 a year that Montblanc builds at its Le Loc factory. Minerva can only make a few hundred a year, and a handful go into non-Montblanc Richemont brand watches, such as Panerai. So 1617, this movement right here is actually 37.52 millimeters in diameter, so it's an enormous case-filling pocket watch caliber, much like the old Rolex Côte d'Ivoire movements and later Angelus SF240s that would have been used in Panerai combat watches. But this is finished to a standard that you would never have found on those, and frankly a standard you don't find on other Panerai timepiece, because Montblanc Villeret has actually created and finished these. They're executed at a level that's comparable to Patek and Vacheron. It's not quite on a Laurent Ferrier Romain Gaultier level, but this is hugely superior to, say, Journe and AP, and again, really on par with standard Patek and Vacheron. You can see that the bevels here are rounded and mirrored, not something you'll see on a standard Panerai watch, where they tend to be a little bit more matte, and you can see the bite marks of the milling wheels. You can see solarization on the crown wheel core and the ratchet wheel with the actual teeth polished. All of the jewel sinks have been beveled. You can see we have an enormous balance manual wind movement. It's the same for both, I should mention. 55-hour power reserve, beats away at 18,000 vibrations per hour, and it has a handmade overcoil hairspring. You can also see just how huge the barrel is. The barrel is almost the radius of the movement. It just barely ends at the center wheel, and you can see that the balance likewise is enormous. So this is a very vintage movement from another era, but doing business in a watch that pays homage to Panerai history in the 40s and the early 1950s. Again, much like a 6154, turn out the light, you can see sandwich dials, a stencil over a fully luminescent disc. They have uncommon depth to them because of the stencil cutout on the luminescent base. Both of these watches feature the same kind of luminescence. That was the 398. This is the 399. And I have to emphasize, because this is the matched serial PAM 784 set, we're going to sell these two together. So if you like one more than the other, you still have to buy them as a pair. We want to keep these matched. I think separating them would be offensive to the collector community. So we bought them as a pair, and we're going to sell them as a pair and maintain that integrity of the set. Now, what I like about Azimuth, the Singaporean Swiss hybrid, is that they like to have fun. And in 2008, they launched Mr. Roboto, a regulator GMT retrograde watch that looks like the 1950s Japanese-made lantern robot tin toy. Well, for 2023, they've sort of floated a test balloon with this piece unique Mr. Roboto Sapphire. Now, the Mr. Roboto Sapphire is an intriguing piece because it looks like an X-ray of a robot. It looks like an X-ray of a standard Mr. Roboto watch. You can see it's got the toy-like winding key crown, and then rather than giving us a view of the module mechanics, there's actually a piece of Damascus-style steel underneath all of this sapphire. And the sapphire is impressive, giving the watch a toy-like lightness as well as a transparency that makes it visible from any side. It's a GMT, so here's your 12-hour format. Here's your independently settable 24-hour format. You can see how you set that right there independently, and you pull the crown out all the way, and now you can adjust everything in sync. And it is a retrograde because we have our hours, our minutes, and this little tri-spoke represents your constant seconds right there. I'll wind them up right there. But you can see we have a retrograde minute display down at the base, and then the 12 and the 24-hour time zones. We've got this little barcode-like feature up at the top of the watch, and this thick bar right here and this thick bar right here, those are the indices against which you read the hours. And the watch is a fun-loving little piece. It is expensive at the equivalent of $23,000 US, but since this is a piece unique, the price of creating a unique set of componentry is rolled into the price of the watch. There are Robotos that you can buy for well under $10,000 if you like the idea and the functions, but you don't want to pay over 20 grand. So this is the king of Mr. Robotos. Just keep in mind, there are far more accessible versions of the watch from Azimuth. Now, automatic winding, 36-hour power reserve, very light, almost impervious to scratches because Sapphire is a 9 on the Mohs scale, so only diamond can routinely scratch it. Strap is super supple, almost buttery, a lot like a Grand Seiko factory strap. They always feel impossibly soft, even when they're brand new, and that's exactly the feeling that I get with this right here. The timepiece, of course, features a couple of curious elements. Of course, Mr. Roboto referencing that 1983 Styx song. And there's a couple of other things. Autobot is written right on the retrograde, and I suspect that's a reference to the good guys in Transformers. And BMF, this is a fun-loving watch. It wants you to be my friend. So a lot to love with Mr. Roboto. Azimuth designs the watches out of Singapore. Chris Long, creator and design chief. He's a watch collector, enthusiast, and an engineer. So he creates the kind of fun watches that he would like to wear using motorcycle, sci-fi, automotive inspiration. You can see this is very clearly the sci-fi inspiration. Just a lot of fun and very, very cool. This is the Mr. Roboto Sapphire. It's just under 50 millimeters lug to lug and about 47.5 millimeters across, not inclusive of the crown. I'll show you once more. I actually own the bronze version of this watch, which is the same size. It's super thick, but it's not particularly broad across the wrist, and it's very wearable. This has always been one of my favorite watches. Nominally launched in 2011, but not really made in volume until after 2015. This is the Patek Philippe 5235G regulator, 40.5 millimeters in white gold. It uses a case inspired by the historic 3448 perpetual calendar of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, and it has the same conical bezel profile. On the reverse side, you can see it served as a launch platform for a new generation of Patek Philippe automatic micro rotor movements. So this is not a 240 of any kind. This is a clean sheet movement with fascinating architecture. As you can see the barrel all the way down to the escapement, there's this lovely crescent-like hollow that surrounds the micro rotor. Automatic winding, 48-hour power reserve. It has a unique beat rate of 23,040 vibrations per hour that's designed for the silicon unlubricated escapement. This is the Pulsamax Oscillomax combination, first broached on the Advanced Research Series watches back in the 2000s, the silicon technology, to operate with a lever and escape wheel, both of silicon and no lubricants between them. And then you have the Spiromax anti-magnetic silicon hairspring. And this movement is 33 millimeters in diameter, whereas the old 24 or 240 is only about 27 millimeters in diameter, so this is a much bigger movement to fill the case back of a modern watch. When you throw it on the wrist, you can see that it's not huge. Easy to wear. It's under 48 millimeters lug to lug, and it's 10.3 millimeters thick, which means, yes, it fits underneath the cuff. It's an annual calendar, and it's a regulator. And it's one of Terry Stern's best designs. First, there's so much about this watch that's different. Starting with the buckle, you can see it has a unique pin buckle design with this sort of vaulted Patek Philippe logo. You don't find that on other Patek models. That was unique to the 5235. You can see the dial features the Patek logo and city of origin engraved rather than printed. We have two different silvers, a sort of silver gray and a silver white. Everything's printed in blue on this dial. And then it's a regulator where we have separated displays for the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. You'll also note that when I pull the crown out, it does activate hacking seconds, so it can be set to a reference time to the second. We have little stepped apertures, and then we have the day, the date, and the month in a aperture style display that's really easy and intuitive to read. This and the 5236 perpetual calendar are my favorite Patek Philippe models, and I would be absolutely thrilled to put this on my wrist. Why haven't I? Mostly because I feel like this is an occasion watch. I just haven't deserved it. Not yet, but someday. What a machine. And while sometimes I think it's a little bit difficult to read, the more I focus on the watch, the easier it is to just read that, right now it's just past 10:16. Not that hard. I think I'm just looking for excuses to forestall a purchase, but I love this thing. Absolutely adore. One of the best watches of the modern era by anyone. And speaking of the best watches of the modern era, here's a masterpiece from Grönefeld. This is the 2016 launch and long discontinued 1941 Remontoire. So they were going to make 188 movements. The case and dial were much more configurable, but they held themselves to 188 movements. The book closed at least 2 years ago on these. And of course, Grönefeld isn't taking orders for any Grönefeld watch at this point. So the only way to get them is to be in the pre-owned space. Now, I believe this is a piece unique, and I'll show you why. Red gold, 1941 case, 39.5 millimeters, and then a Carré-Vaudelaine and hand-cut sterling silver blue galvanized dial. So the dial is made of sterling silver, cut on a rose lathe, and then blue galvanized, done by Catalogue, which is the Carré-Vaudelaine and dial factory. You could see it uses, depending on how you interpret it, either a vogue or a wave pattern, or écaille de poisson, which would be a fish scale. What's also unique here is that we have that pattern on a step dial in blue over sterling silver with clou de Paris in the small seconds, and you can see all of the indices as well as all three hands have been media blasted to create a matte silver finish that is highly uncharacteristic of Grönefeld dials, where these features tend to be polished and blued for the hands and mirror polished for the indices. We have none of that. All of this is subdued media blasted silver. Now let me move the hour hand out of the way. It is a Remontoire d'égalité. I got some friends in the background, and I'm going to ignore them. Let me just make sure it's not the Grönefelds. No, it wasn't Tim and Bart. Quel dommage. I would have put them on speaker if it had been. So we have this little regulator up in the corner. Every 8 seconds, the Remontoire releases energy from the mainspring into a secondary spring that propels the escapement for 8 seconds, and then it releases again. Now this little flywheel here acts as a damper and a regulator to reduce the shock on the drivetrain as the energy is transmitted, and also to slow it down a little bit. There's a similar feature on the Zeitwerk, an air brake that slows down the crush of energy as it flows through the jumping mechanism. So that's what this is here. It's a damper of sorts and a governor. Now when you flip it over, you can see this G0F movement is spectacular. Look at all that black polished steel, and it is steel. Only the base plate of this movement is made of brass. All of the bridges are made of steel. So there are two different types of bridge here. You can see the ones that are entirely black polished, like the bridge for the triple locking lever that acts as a buffer between the drivetrain and the escapement. You can see that in action. So there are these black polished bridges that are satinated. Well, I should say they're actually beveled on their side. They're polished on their top, and then they're polished again on their side. The satination is on the bell gable style bridges. They're designed like the bell gable roofs of traditional Dutch houses. So we have media blasting on their recesses, and then you can see there's satination or channels of brushed finish along their side. And then if you get all the way to the edge, you can see that there's also polish on the edge. So these bridges are triple finished, and then these bridges are double finished with polish on the top, and yes, you can see beveling on the side. The pivot jewels from the great wheel all the way down to the escape wheel, they're fitted in golden chaton cups, which is a nod to the pocket watch era. 35-hour power reserve, and during those 35 hours, the force to the escapement is constant. You can see that release every 8 seconds. There's a sort of epicyclic gearing, like a planetary. And when this tooth this little tooth jewel slips. You can see how there are these little teeth outboard, and they interact with that jewel. At the point that it slips, it releases the energy, which travels on a drivetrain under the dial, because you don't actually see a wheel between the Remontoire and the escape wheel. It travels under the dial to the escapement, and then the escapement impulses a balance that beats away at 3 hertz. It's both free sprung and mounted on an overcoil hairspring. And here you can really see the Audemars Piguet Renoir Papy pedigree of Grönefeld with the quality of the finish. My favorite piece here is actually the barrel assembly. You can see the barrel has been deeply grooved with solarization, but then there's a super fine solarization across the ratchet wheel atop the barrel. There's mirror polishing on its interior recess. You can see the core of the ratchet wheel has been polished, and then the actual teeth that merge with the crown wheel and the intermediate wheels, those teeth have polished and beveled micro edges. And then you can see that we have a polished and beveled click and a black polished extended click spring. So this assembly right here is my favorite part of the whole movement. Make no mistake, the Remontoire is physically and technically impressive, but at the same time, I feel like all of the romance is over on this side. But you cannot go wrong with this watch. Buffalo strap, you can see buffalo in blue and Dutch orange on the back. Of course, these watches are made in the Netherlands, in Oldenzaal. We have this lovely buckle that features both polish and interior media blasting, with a profile that matches the lovely scalloped and evacuated lugs of the 1941 case. I apologize for that intervention a moment ago. If you have any further questions, email me at tmosso@thewatchbox.com. I'm not quite ready to give out my phone number on the internet, but someone may already have guessed it. Time out, Tim out, and thanks for logging on.